The chamber of the Galactic Assembly was designed to intimidate, and it usually worked. A vast amphitheater carved into a hollowed asteroid where gravity was tuned low to favor the larger species. Light spectra were calibrated to alien eyes, and the air composition subtly stressed mammalian lungs. And into this room humanity walked carrying nothing but tablets, fabric uniforms, and expressions that many in the chamber mistook for nervousness rather than calculation, because by every visible metric humans were the weakest species present, shorter than the armored Krell, softer than the silicon-based Vote, slower than the insectile Charon, and utterly unimpressive beside the towering Axiarch delegates whose bodies shimmered with bioluminescent authority, and the murmurs started immediately, rippling through translator fields as assessments were shared. Low gravity tolerance poor, exoskeleton absent, no natural weapons, limited lifespan, emotionally expressive, and therefore exploitable. And at the center of it all stood Elena Park, Earth's appointed ambassador, a former logistics officer turned diplomat whose greatest talent was not rhetoric but patience, the kind learned from watching supply chains collapse and knowing exactly when to let people fail on their own. And she listened as the Speaker of the Assembly, a many-limbed entity called Frexel, formally opened the session by summarizing humanity's status review in a tone that was almost kind but not quite, explaining that after 2 decades of observation, consensus was clear that humanity posed no meaningful threat, no significant contribution, and no reason to be granted expanded territorial rights beyond their local stellar cluster, which drew a ripple of approving vibration from several delegations, because the galaxy ran on hierarchy and humanity sat comfortably at the bottom. And when Frexel invited responses, the Krell War adjudicator spoke first, stating bluntly that humanity's expansion rate was inefficient, their ships underarmed, their reliance on alliances a sign of weakness rather than strategy, and suggested that Earth systems be placed under a protective mandate administered by stronger powers for their own safety, which in galactic terms meant controlled trade, monitored research, and the slow suffocation of independence. And Elena noticed how several delegates leaned forward at that, not out of concern but appetite, because humanity occupied a resource rich region with convenient hyperlane access, and being weak in the galaxy was not a protected status. It was an invitation, and still she said nothing, because the rules of the Assembly favored those who spoke last, and the chair and envoy added that human emotional volatility made them unreliable partners, citing recorded incidents of humans refusing advantageous trade deals out of what they termed moral objections, which earned clicks of amusement, while the Vote mathematician projected probability curves showing that humanity would either stagnate or fracture within 3 centuries without external guidance, and through it all the Assembly data feed scrolled past on Elena's tablet. Not the public summaries, but the hidden layers, the bandwidth fluctuations, the sensor pings, the subtle shifts in fleet telemetry as multiple powers repositioned assets just a little closer to Sol, because they all smell blood. And finally Frexel turned to the human delegation and offered them the courtesy of response, framing it as an opportunity to accept assistance gracefully, and Elena stepped forward, adjusted to the gravity like someone who had trained for it rather than endured it, and thanked the Assembly for concern in a calm voice that carried easily without amplification, acknowledging humanity's physical limitations and relatively short galactic history, agreeing openly that humans lacked natural weapons in imposing forms, and this candor disarmed the room, because weakness confessed was weakness confirmed. And she continued by explaining that humans had always known they were fragile, that from the moment they first looked up at a hostile universe filled with radiation, vacuum, and extinction events, they had understood that survival would never be about being the strongest creature in the room, but about something harder to quantify. And she spoke of persistence, of iteration, of failing quickly and adapting faster, concepts that the Assembly understood academically but had never truly embodied because most species present had evolved dominance first and intelligence second, and she noted that humanity had survived not by outgrowing its predators but by outthinking environments that wanted them dead, which earned polite attention but little respect, because philosophy did not move fleets. And then she did something unexpected. She formally declined the protective mandate, stating that Earth appreciated the offer but would continue to manage its own affairs. And the chamber reacted immediately, not with outrage but with incredulous amusement, because refusal implied leverage, and everyone in the room knew humans had none, and Frexel gently reminded her that declining the mandate would remove certain trade protections and legal shields, exposing human shipping in colonies to increased risk, and Elena nodded and said they were aware. And that was when the first quiet alert reached the Assembly's internal systems, a minor anomaly, flagged by long-range sensors at the edge of map space, dismissed at first as background noise, then corrected, then flagged again with rising priority, because something was moving, not fast, not aggressively, but with scale, vast mass shadows slipping between stars and patterns that did not match known species or natural phenomena, and as technicians quietly cross-checked data. Elena concluded her statement by saying that humans had never sought to be the strongest species in the room, because strength invited challenge, but they had invested heavily in ensuring they would never be the weakest variable in anyone else's equation, and she returned to her place just as a junior analyst on Frexel's staff interrupted protocol to whisper that multiple unknown constructs had been detected activating beyond human space, ancient, dormant until moments ago, responding to signals that were unmistakably human in origin, and for the first time since humanity entered the galactic stage. The laughter in the assembly chamber died not because a weapon had been revealed, but because something far older had just woken up, and it had answered to Earth. The assembly chamber shifted from indulgent boredom to restrained alarm with remarkable speed, not because anyone admitted fear, but because fear expressed itself in procedures, in the sudden tightening of security fields, in the way private channels lit up as delegates demanded clarifications from their intelligence staffs, and Elena Park felt the gravity change subtly as emergency stabilizers compensated for power rerouting, which told her the assembly was already taking the anomaly seriously. Even as Frexel attempted to maintain decorum by formally recessing debate until the sensor irregularities could be explained, and that choice alone marked a turning point because recesses were how the powerful bought time when certainty evaporated, and on the main display the long-range projections expanded to show the mass shadows resolving into structures. Not ships in any conventional sense, but mega-scale frameworks unfolding from folded space like patient machines stretching after a long sleep. Each one dwarfing capital fleets and arranged with deliberate geometry rather than military formation, and the first whispered hypothesis rippled through the chamber. Precursor artifacts, a phrase that carried weight because precursor civilizations were the unspoken nightmare of every starfaring species, proof that something older and smarter had come before and vanished for reasons no one liked to contemplate. And the vote mathematician began recalculating probability curves in real time, its crystalline lattice flickering as assumptions collapsed, because the presence of active precursor technology within or adjacent to human territory invalidated centuries of strategic doctrine, and the Krell War adjudicator demanded immediate confirmation of ownership, because if humanity controlled even one such construct, the balance of power tilted dangerously, and Elena remained seated, hands folded, face neutral, because she had spent years learning how to look unremarkable while holding the only card that mattered, and when Frexel finally addressed her directly again, the tone had changed. Still polite but sharpened by urgency, asking whether humanity had prior knowledge of the detected structures, and she answered truthfully that they had known something was there, but not precisely what, because humans had a long tradition of building tools to listen to the universe rather than shout at it, and decades earlier those tools had picked up patterns in the cosmic background radiation that suggested intentional modulation, like fingerprints buried beneath static, and instead of announcing it, they had done what humans always did when faced with something bigger than themselves. They studied quietly, tested hypotheses, and prepared contingencies, and as she spoke, the assembly feeds filled with archival data forcibly declassified by human authority under emergency transparency protocols, showing probe missions that vanished without trace, autonomous drones that returned stripped of memory but intact, and finally a sequence of mathematical signals exchanged between Earth-based observatories and something ancient that responded only after humanity demonstrated an ability to understand its logic rather than impose their own, and the room grew cold as comprehension set in, because this was not conquest technology or stolen relics. This was dialogue. And the Charon envoy clicked nervously and asked the question everyone was avoiding. What exactly? Had humanity awakened? And Elena said that awakening was a wrong word, because the construct had never been dormant in the way organics understood sleep. They had been waiting, not for dominance or aggression, but for proof of cognitive resilience, for a species that could survive its own worst impulses long enough to ask better questions, and that humanity had qualified not because they were peaceful, but because they were violent and learned to restrain it, not because they were united, but because they fractured and rebuilt without erasing themselves. And at that point the main display updated again, showing one of the constructs altering its orientation, emitting a signal that cut cleanly through every known communication band without interference, and the translators lagged for a fraction of a second before rendering a message that did not identify a species or claim territory but stated a single declarative fact. Custodial status confirmed. Contingency protocols disengaged. Monitored species elevated to partner classification, and the effect on the assembly was immediate and profound. Because in galactic law, custodian was a title older than the assembly itself, a designation reserved for civilizations entrusted by precursors to manage technologies capable of reshaping stellar ecosystems, and the Krell War adjudicator's posture shifted from dominance to calculation. Because attacking a custodian species was not just war, it was extinction-level stupidity. And Frexel's bioluminescence dimmed involuntarily as it requested clarification on the scope of humanity's custodial authority, and Elena replied that humanity did not command the constructs, they cooperated with them, and that the agreement was simple. Humans would act as stewards, ensuring no single species used precursor systems to dominate the galaxy, including themselves, and the irony landed hard because the weakest species in the room had just revealed that it was the one trusted to keep everyone else in check, and as secondary alerts flooded in showing fleets halting their repositioning and trade blocks suspending hostile motions, Elena finally stood again and added one final clarification, that humanity had no intention of punishing the assembly for its assumptions, but they would not forget them either, because restraint was a choice they made daily, not a limitation imposed by others. And in the silence that followed, the galaxy began, for the first time, to recalibrate its understanding of what weakness actually looked like. The recalibration did not happen all at once, because galaxies did not turn on a single revelation any more than civilizations did, but it began with the smallest shifts that only systems analysts and veteran diplomats noticed, the sudden delay in sanction proposals that had once sailed through. The careful rewording of intelligence briefings where humanity was no longer described as a peripheral concern, but as a stabilizing factor, a phrase that unsettled everyone because stability implied authority without overt power, and in the days following the assembly session the custodial construct did not advance or posture, they simply remained visible, impossible to ignore, each one a silent punctuation mark at the edge of human space, and Elena Park returned to Earth under escort that was technically ceremonial but practically defensive, because no one trusted anyone else enough to leave the humans unguarded. And aboard the transport she reviewed the internal fallout reports, noting, with some grim amusement, how many species were suddenly discovering historical records of human aid they had previously dismissed as minor footnotes, disaster relief fleets that arrived without fanfare, medical technologies shared without patents, border skirmishes diffused quietly through back channels, all of it now being reinterpreted not as weakness but as pattern, and on Earth the response was predictably messy, because humans process existential shifts through argument, celebration, fear, and conspiracy all at once, and the revelation of custodial partnership ignited debates across every network about whether humanity had just painted a target on itself, whether they had a moral right to act as galactic stewards, and whether restraint could survive temptation now that the galaxy was finally listening, and Elena addressed none of it publicly at first, because she understood that leadership was sometimes about letting people exhaust their worst instincts before asking them to be better. And while humans argued the galaxy moved, the Krell convened emergency war councils not to plan attacks but to audit every scenario in which they might accidentally provoke humanity. The Charin withdrew exploratory swarms from contested systems, suddenly eager to be seen as cooperative. And the vote recalculated long-term projections that now extended beyond heat-death models into socio-political stability curves anchored around human decision-making, which horrified them because humans were notoriously unpredictable at small scales even when stable at large ones, and amid all this Frexel requested a private audience with Elena, invoking an ancient diplomatic clause that allowed for bilateral dialogue outside assembly oversight, and when they met again it was not in the intimidating amphitheater but in a neutral orbital habitat with standardized gravity and atmosphere, a subtle concession that did not go unnoticed, and Frexel abandoned formalities quickly, admitting that the assembly had misjudged humanity not because of ignorance but because of bias, because the galaxy equated visible strength with intent, and humans hid their intent behind compromise and process, and Elena responded that humans did not hide it, they struggled with it openly, arguing in public, failing loudly, correcting slowly, which made them look chaotic to species that prized unity over adaptability. And Frexel asked a question that now haunted every council chamber, why the precursors had chosen humans. And Elena answered with a story rather than a statistic, describing early Earth history when humans built weapons capable of ending themselves and then spent generations arguing about whether they should exist at all, building safeguards not because they trusted themselves, but because they did not. And the precursors, she explained, were not looking for purity or peace. They were looking for a species that understood its own capacity for destruction and chose limits anyway. Because only such a species could be trusted to stand between power and annihilation, and Frexel absorbed this in silence, bioluminescence shifting through uneasy patterns, before asking what humanity wanted now, and Elena was honest in a way that surprised even herself, saying they wanted the same thing they had always wanted: room to grow without being crushed, partners rather than patrons, and the freedom to make mistakes without the galaxy turning them into catastrophes. And she added that custodianship was not a crown but a burden, one they had accepted because someone had to, and because saying no would have been easy but wrong. And when the meeting ended, the galaxy did not suddenly bow to humanity, but something far more dangerous and enduring happened. It began to defer, to wait and watch human reactions before acting. And back in the assembly halls, analysts updated threat matrices and influence maps with a new unspoken rule that no one dared write down, that the weakest species in the room was now the one everyone quietly hoped would keep its temper, because if humanity ever stopped choosing restraint, the galaxy had already learned there would be no one strong enough to force it back. Restraint, Elena knew, was never a permanent state. It was a muscle that weakened without use, and the galaxy tested it almost immediately, not through open defiance, but through the oldest tactic in politics, plausible deniability. When a border incident flared along the Heliox spur where a minor client species of the Krell Confederacy clashed with a human-aligned trade convoy, the reports contradictory, the footage incomplete, and the blame carefully diffused across a fog of misunderstandings. And on paper it looked insignificant. A few disabled ships, no confirmed casualties, exactly the kind of incident the Assembly used to quietly bury. But this time the currents beneath it were unmistakable, because a convoy carried relief infrastructure bound for a neutral system recovering from stellar instability, and the attack vector suggested testing rather than desperation, probing how quickly humanity would respond, and whether custodianship meant intervention or hesitation. And Elena watched the briefing stack up in her office on Luna, noting how often the phrase unintended escalation appeared, a euphemism humans used when they were lying to themselves, and the internal debate reignited instantly, one faction arguing that any response would confirm galactic fears of human overreach, another insisting that failure to act would invite further erosion of trust and embolden those who believed humans were still weak beneath the new title, and through it all the custodial construct remained motionless, offering no guidance, because it had always been conditioned that humanity would choose its own actions and live with the consequences, and Elena requested counsel not from admirals or politicians, but from an oversight group few outside Earth knew existed, the Continuity Forum, a rotating assembly of historians, systems engineers, ethicists, and disaster response veterans whose mandate was brutally simple: to ask what future humans would curse their ancestors for failing to do. And the answer came back fragmented but consistent: that allowing aid convoys to be attacked without consequence would normalize predation again, undoing decades of fragile progress. And so the response was calibrated with surgical precision, not a fleet mobilization but an announcement, a public declaration backed by incontrovertible data, releasing sensor logs that showed the attack trajectory, the command signatures, and the deliberate disabling of escape pods. And then humanity invoked a clause older than the assembly itself, a custodian arbitration right that allowed them to impose temporary enforcement measures to prevent recurrence, and the galaxy held its breath when the measures activated, because for the first time constructs move, not toward the aggressor worlds, but into the disputed corridor itself, unfolding into a lattice of gravitational anchors and sensor webs that made an authorized weapons discharge physically impossible within the zone, a neutralization field that did not punish but prevented, and the effect was immediate and humiliating for those who had orchestrated the test, because their fleets could not even posture without being gently but inexorably shut down, and the Krell Confederacy protested loudly, framing it as an infringement on sovereign space. But the protest rang hollow because no one had died, no territory had changed hands, and the convoy reached its destination intact under the watchful indifference of ancient machines. And Elena addressed the assembly afterward in a broadcast that was firm without theatrics, stating that humanity would not retaliate for the incident, nor would they escalate it. but that they would not permit the galaxy to slide back into a hierarchy where the strong fed on the weak under bureaucratic cover. And she made it clear that custodianship did not mean humans would decide who ruled, only that they would intervene when rules designed to prevent annihilation were tested for convenience. And the message landed harder than any weapon demonstration, because it framed humanity not as conquerors but as referees, a role no species wanted assigned to someone else yet secretly needed. And over the following cycles the test stopped, not because resentment faded, but because the cost-benefit analysis changed. Predation without plausible deniability was dangerous, and plausibility itself was now being audited by humans who had spent centuries perfecting the art of forensic accountability. And Elena felt the weight of it settle in, the realization that the galaxy was no longer asking whether humans were weak, but whether they were fair, a far more terrifying question for civilizations built on advantage. And late one night, alone in her office, she allowed herself a moment of doubt, because fairness required constant vigilance, and vigilance required strength of a different kind, the kind that did not show on scanners or battle projections. And she wondered how long humanity could carry that burden without becoming the very thing the galaxy feared, even as the constructs held their silent watch, and the weakest species in the room continued to choose, again and again, not to flinch. What finally broke the illusion that restraint alone would be enough was not an act of open aggression, but an accident engineered so carefully that everyone involved pretended to believe it was fate. When a deep-core energy extraction array in the Carson Reach catastrophically failed, collapsing a young star's magnetic envelope and sending a radiation surge through 3 inhabited systems, one of them home to a pre-warp civilization under assembly protection, and the official report cited natural instability while quietly burying the truth that the array had been operating beyond agreed safety threshold to meet military production quotas. And Elena saw the pattern instantly because humans had lived through versions of this lie on their own planet for centuries, progress without accountability dressed up as inevitability. And the galaxy's initial response followed an old script: condolences issued, aid promised, committees formed, and behind it all an unspoken assumption that the custodians would clean up the mess quietly as they always did. But this time the cost curve crossed a line, because a construct could stabilize the star but not undo the genetic damage already inflicted on millions of lives, and the Continuity Forum's assessment was blunt in a way that made Elena physically tense, stating that failure to impose consequence here would teach every industrial power that catastrophe could be outsourced to apology, and so humanity did something no custodian had ever done before. They named names, releasing a detailed causal chain that traced the disaster from boardroom decisions to falsified safety audits to the moment the array breached tolerance, and they paired it with a sanction that did not target civilians or trade but capability, temporarily revoking the Carson Reach's access to high-energy fabrication corridors enforced by the construct themselves, effectively freezing their military-industrial expansion without firing a shot. And the backlash was immediate and furious. Accusations of overreach and tyranny flooding the assembly, emergency sessions called where delegates thundered about precedent and balance. But the outrage faltered when Elena calmly presented the alternative, which was to allow civilizations to gamble with extinction-level tools so long as they were strong enough to survive the fallout. And she asked a question that cut deeper than any threat: whether the galaxy truly wanted a future where survival was proof of innocence. And in the uneasy silence that followed the sanction held, not because everyone agreed, but because no one could argue against the logic without indicting themselves, and on Earth the reaction was just as divided, protests erupting alongside quiet approval, because humans understood instinctively that justice without force was still force, just slower and harder to see, and Elena carried that knowledge heavily, knowing that humanity had crossed from referee to enforcer, whether they liked the label or not. And as the constructs adjusted their patrol geometries and the galaxy absorbed the reality that custodianship now included consequence, the weakest species in the room took another step away from being underestimated and one step closer to being feared, not for what they could destroy, but for what they refused to excuse. Fear, once seeded, had a way of fermenting into desperation, and desperation made even rational civilization stupid, which was why the first true challenge to human custodianship did not come from a reckless minor power but from a quiet coalition of major species who had concluded that humanity's enforcement model was unsustainable and therefore had to be broken early, before it calcified into permanent authority. And they did it the only way they thought might work, by manufacturing crisis. Too large, too fast, and too morally tangled for humans to intervene without tearing themselves apart. When simultaneous uprisings erupted across 5 sectors involving client species long suppressed by their patrons, each conflict framed as an internal matter but timed so precisely that it overwhelmed assembly response mechanisms, and the coalition's calculation was elegant in its cruelty. Either humanity intervened and proved they were willing to dictate internal governance across the galaxy, validating every fear of human tyranny, or they abstained and allowed mass civilian casualties that would shatter the myth of fair custodianship and Elena saw the trap for what it was a moment the alerts synchronized, because humans recognize coordinated chaos instinctively, having lived through information-age disinformation storms on their own world. And she convened an emergency session not of the Assembly but of the Human Planetary Council, bypassing weeks of procedure and hours because that was another thing the galaxy misunderstood about humans, that beneath their arguments they could move with terrifying speed when a line was crossed, and the decision that emerged was neither neutrality nor domination but exposure, a tactic so human it bordered on instinct, and within a single cycle humanity released a comprehensive, unfiltered data cascade, broadcasting historical economic dependencies, coercive treaties, proxy enforcement records, and population suppression metrics for every sector in conflict, not editorialized, not weaponized, simply laid bare with the receipts attached, and the effect was explosive, because the uprisings were no longer isolated flashes of unrest but part of a visible pattern of exploitation that no amount of diplomatic spin could contain, and the coalition scrambled to regain narrative control, accusing humans of destabilization and information warfare. But the accusation rang hollow because the data was accurate, verifiable, and already spreading faster than sensors could react. And as worlds across the galaxy began asking their own uncomfortable questions, the constructs made their final, most unsettling move yet. They opened themselves to inspection, granting assembly scientists limited access to their internal governance protocols, revealing that their enforcement logic was not aligned to human command but to statistical thresholds of existential risk, and that humanity's role was advisory, interpretive, and uniquely constrained by a veto system designed to prevent exactly the kind of imperial overreach the coalition feared, and this revelation shattered the last plausible argument that humans were secretly consolidating absolute power, because the safeguards were real, ancient, and brutally impartial, and Elena addressed the galaxy one last time during the crisis, not with threats or moral posturing, but with a simple statement that humans would not choose between tyranny and indifference, that they would continue to expose systems that made violence inevitable and intervene only when annihilation thresholds were crossed, and that any civilization uncomfortable with that standard was free to withdraw from the shared framework and accept the risks alone. And one by one the coalition fractured, some backing down quietly, others doubling down and finding their financial and logistical networks evaporating as partners defected. And when the uprisings burned themselves out not through conquest but through negotiated reform under relentless public scrutiny, the galaxy understood something it had never fully grasped before, that humanity's greatest weapon was not the ancient machines of their side, but their refusal to let power hide behind complexity, and for the first time fear began to shift, not away from humans, but toward the old ways that humans had made impossible to ignore. By the time the last sector stabilized and the data storms faded into a new, quieter equilibrium, the galaxy felt older, not in years but in awareness, like a civilization that had lost the luxury of pretending it did not know how its comforts were paid for, and humanity found itself standing in a place no species had ever stood comfortably, trusted enough to arbitrate, feared enough to deter, and scrutinized enough to make every mistake unforgivable, and Elena Park felt the weight of that. Reality most acutely during the final assembly session convened to formally redefine custodianship, because titles had a way of outliving intentions, and she would determine that this one would not rot into myth or tyranny, and as delegates gathered there was no posturing, no theatrical dominance displays, only wary attention, because everyone understood that whatever framework emerged would shape the next 1,000 years, and Elena spoke plainly, rejecting proposals that would grant humanity permanent authority or exclusive control, instead advocating for distributed custodial counsel with humanity as a first among equals, not because they were superior, but because they had already borne the cost of going first, and she insisted on sunset clauses, mandatory audits, and transparent failure protocols written directly into galactic law, safeguards so aggressive that several delegates openly balked, because no civilization liked rules that assumed future corruption, and Elena answered that assumption calmly. saying humans wrote rules that way because they expected to fail eventually and wanted the damage contained when they did, and that honesty landed harder than any assertion of virtue, and when the framework passed by a narrow but decisive margin, the galaxy did not erupt in celebration. It exhaled, because survival had been chosen over pride. And in the cycles that followed, humanity did not expand aggressively or consolidate power. They did something far stranger and more unsettling. They normalized restraint, stepping back whenever possible, forcing local resolutions, intervening only when thresholds were crossed, and slowly the galaxy adapted, conflict becoming harder to hide, exploitation riskier to justify, and strength less about domination and more about resilience under scrutiny. And years later, long after Lena retired from public life, a new generation of assembly delegates studied recordings of that first session where humans had been. Dismissed as weak, analyzing it not with contempt but with fascination, because it marked the moment the galaxy learned that power did not always announce itself with claws or cannons, and in quiet corners of space, among species still measuring strength in tonnage and kill ratios, a new proverb began to circulate, stripped of irony and fear, stating simply that if the humans were calm, things could still be fixed, but if they ever stopped trying to explain themselves, then the galaxy had already made a mistake it would not survive, and so the weakest species in the room passed into legend not as conquerors or saviors, but as the ones who proved that true strength was knowing exactly how much force you could wield, and choosing, every single time, to use less.